My name is Christina Clayton, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center here in the Northwest region. And if you are so kind and can fill out the poll, this just lets us know who's here, who's in the room, what kind of role you are. I know it only allows for one option, but we're very excited to have you here today. We're talking with Dr. Kira Massath about when is the crisis really over? Resilience for in-person crisis and first responder staff and teams. We want to start first with our land acknowledgement. We always want to engage and think about in our events what lands we live and work on and acknowledge the unceded ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. We don't do this out of a checkbox kind of activity. We really want to acknowledge and forever do better and be better stewards and talk about how to do action and advocacy and really promote social justice for these communities. So that's why we mention this. And if you want to learn more about the stewards of your land, we'll put a link in the chat. All right. A little bit about our network. So the MHTTC network is nationwide and is supported by SAMHSA, otherwise known as Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And we have 10 regional centers, a national Alaska and American Indian Alaska Native Center. We also have a national Hispanic and Latino center and a network coordinating office. And if you didn't know, there are actually other networks just like this for about 30 years in the addiction field, and more recently, like we are in the last 4 years, in the prevention field. And so here in the Northwest, we're honored to work with HHS Region 10, Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. But as you know, it's virtual, so anyone can join, and we're happy to have everyone here today. A little bit about our specific Northwest MHTTC. We are based in University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And although our area of focus for the network is evidence-based practices for psychosis, such as cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis and assertive community treatment, we train on a lot of topics. So diversity, equity issues, integrated care, suicide prevention, school mental health, peer support, and others. And how do we do that? We do free training and technical assistance, online webinars such as this. We record those and post those. Those will be available later. We will include the slides. We do virtual learning communities and even a podcast. And so we also provide newsletters, resource libraries, and announcements. So if you want to find out more, we'll show you how you can sign up to learn about the next event we hold. In our network, we always want to be mindful of using affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language. And so our network agreed to put these slides, this particular one at each of our events. We know there are a lot of perspectives, and that's one of the benefits of doing these kind of events. So just communicating in ways that are respectful, non-judgmental, and inclusive, and accepting of diverse abilities and experiences. I think one thing we've noticed is, chat can get pretty excited, and, just being, graceful with if someone makes a comment that you aren't really in agreement with, it's okay. We're trying to be learning and all of that. So thank you for your attention to that. Housekeeping, you're muted and off camera. It's a webinar. We are recorded. We will have closed captioning if you chose to do that. So you can do that on your screen. We will share the video recording and slides and how to obtain a certificate of attendance. We don't have formal CEs, but this should help you if you need to do that. Please use the chat for technical issues, or if you want to shout out to the group, share your comments or an observation. But if you do have a question for Dr. Massath, please put that in the Q&A box. I can't copy and paste it from the chat, and if the chat is very active, we might lose that. So appreciate attention to that as well. We will get to Q&A at the end, and we'll do as much as we can, but I will be queuing those up. So please throw them in early so we can know how many we might be facing at the end with Dr. Massath. So lastly, your feedback is really crucial, and we look at all your feedback for every event. It's a short survey, literally takes 2 minutes. It does ask for something called a personal code. It'll ask for different numbers and letters from your person. Use whatever ones you want. This is a one-time event. We don't need to match anything. We just really want your feedback. So please put in what you're comfortable with and just get us your input. It's really helpful. It's all aggregated, so we don't know who said what. We'll share that in the chat box today, probably before 12:30 in case anyone has to leave early, but we really appreciate it. And we are required to do it. It keeps the free training coming. So we like that. And then also SAMHSA funds us, but they don't have opinions about any specific content. So I do want to say, very, very grateful. If you've been around our center at all for the last couple of years, we've been working with Dr. Kira Maseth for a while now, and she's fantastic. If you haven't seen her before, I think you'll be very happily pleased with the content. She's very real and pragmatic. She's a practical, I don't know how many jobs she has, but it feels like there's at least 4. She's a practicing clinical psychologist who splits her professional time between seeing patients at Snohomish Psychology Associates. She also is a senior instructor at Seattle University and teaches there. She serves as a co-lead for the behavioral health strike team for the Washington State Department of Health. She also serves on the state's disaster medical advisory committee. Her work and research interests focus on resilience and recovery from trauma, as well as disaster behavioral health. She's worked abroad extensively in disaster response and with first responders and healthcare organizations and workers across the United States. And on top of all that, she does things like today, conducting trainings and providing presentations to organizations and educational groups about disaster preparedness, resilience building within local communities. So that all to say, Kira, we're so happy to have you here today. I want to let you say a little hi, and then we're going to do a quick Mentimeter. I forgot to share the Mentimeter information. We'll get that in the chat right now. But hi, Kira.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I really look forward to talking with you all and making some progress, hopefully, around this difficult to pin down thing called resilience. So that's what we're going to work on today.
Yes.
And as Christina mentioned, I think she's going to put some Mentimeter, a Mentimeter question up. It looks like it's in the chat.
Yes, perfect. So yeah, you're going to just type into your browser, if you can, www.menti.com, and then use that code, and we're going to share that. So we wanted to start with just a question to the group. You know, all of you are doing or may have done crisis response work in person. And I know that I did want to say, you know, we can share the results of the poll. So we kind of, you know, only have so many options. And, you know, you mentioned, you know, what you're doing, where you're working, and how long you've been in the field. But what brought you to in-person crisis work? What keeps you hopeful and inspired? I mean, I think it's something that we talked about earlier about what is our purpose? What is our mission for doing this work? So if you go to Menti, you can type in more than one answer if you like. You can just type in some words or a short phrase, and it would just be really great to hear what brought you to this work. If for some reason Menti is not working for you, you can put it in the chat. We'd prefer it to stay in Menti because then we can grab that stuff later and kind of see, but we're just seeing what people are sharing. Yeah, so thank you for that. Sure, no, I understand. Thank you. And if you you can type it in later in the chat or do something else, we want to make sure this is helpful. Okay, we'll make sure our team here, Kristen and Gabriel, can help maybe work on the tech side. But thank you for putting these answers in. So personal experience was helped in my life. Not everyone can or may want to do. Help people feel seen and understood. Money, just kidding. Yeah, it's the fame. You know, no, it's not. Yeah, family history. It's real. Oh, this is so wonderful. We're going to leave this available to you as Kira gets started because it is so imperative that we hear from you. And, you know, we know these webinars can only be so engaging and interactive, but we're so grateful to get your personal experience and what inspires you to come to this work and stay in this work. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. So please keep putting those in. We will turn things over to you, Kira, but we will look at all your answers regardless of when you type them in. So we're excited. We'll do this one more time within Kira's presentation. So you'll pause for this and then we'll ask another question and then we'll do another question near the end in the chat. So other than that, Kira, we'll let you take it away. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to jump into the slides. And yeah, please add some questions in the Q&A. We'll have some time at the end for that. I'm going to go pretty quickly over some of the slides just for the sake of time, but you will have access to the entire slide deck when we get done. So if I go a little bit too quickly over certain things, just bear with me. There's a reason for that. And I'm trying to prioritize what I think are sort of the most important things for me to highlight verbally with you today, and you'll have access to the rest of it later. So I'm going to talk about the context for crisis response work with the layers of a global pandemic and kind of what that means to us emotionally and physiologically, specific challenges for responders in crisis, and then what do we do, right? I really want to bring things home that are not more work for you. I want to give you some ideas about practical suggestions for behavioral health support that don't add more things on your to-do list. And then I have a model to share with you called Thrive, which is intended to highlight evidence-based best practices for content, like things to consider, things for your work groups and your teams, your family, things that you might apply both personally and professionally. So I'll just jump in here. This is a chart that was originally designed by SAMHSA several years ago to reflect the phases that humans experience when we undertake a large-scale disaster of any kind. A hurricane, a flood, it turns out it doesn't really matter, and a global pandemic is on the list. So we have the impact phase. Each phase is sort of characterized by different behavioral health concerns. The disillusionment phase is the hardest part of the disaster cycle. And then we get into the final phase, which is reconstruction, which in most disasters is a literal reconstruction of bridges and houses and roads. In the context of the pandemic, reconstruction is more cultural. It's educational. It's financial and economic, and social with our relationships. And so the degree of complexity and the length of time that we have experienced these sorts of stressors over the course of a pandemic really have influenced the nature of how we do crisis response work, and also the resources that are available to us to do it, whether it's budget or staffing or our own personal just exhaustion around a lot of things. So please keep in mind some of this context. This is a chart that I designed for the Department of Health here in Washington to reflect what happened here in Washington state as a function of a disaster cascade. So every geographical area, and I saw folks in the chat, from Florida and from all over the United States coming in today, which I really appreciate. But the takeaway is this. It is very likely that in your geographical area, you had at least 3 large-scale disaster impacts over the last couple of years. The original COVID impact was in 2020, right? The year that didn't end for whatever reason. And then we had another impact with a Delta variant and a third with Omicron. Now, if you've had hurricanes or tornadoes or floods or other things that have also impacted your region, those are other types of large-scale disaster events that can restart this cycle. And so the bottom line is this. If human beings are given the opportunity to recover from disasters, we usually can do so in terms of our behavioral health in about 18 to 22 months. We have not had the privilege of being able to do that with the pandemic because we keep getting hit with additional things. So disaster cascades actually aren't that uncommon. They do happen, but it raises the complexity of the entire recovery process when there are additional hurdles, and it lengthens the time that it takes us to kind of get our bearings and establish a baseline for our coping skills and behavioral health. So it's very complex, as you all know, because we're in it. I wanted to take a moment here at the beginning to also highlight for you a snapshot of the current behavioral health issues that face us just generally based on age demographics. So for young kids, there are some new studies that have come out that show pretty significant developmental regression, which is normal after large-scale disasters, but also some delay with motor skills and verbal skills for babies that were born during the pandemic that are really having difficulty making some social adjustments and sort of doing some of that physiological growth markers in terms of attainment that we would typically expect. For kids in the kindergarten through 8th grade range, we are looking at emotion regulation difficulties. Kids that were previously pretty well adjusted that now sit, with their head down on the desk or flip over a desk, and they're behaviorally either acting in or acting out. And then a lot of academic challenges. And I imagine I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but from a behavioral health lens, The issues that are being experienced by our kids in K-12 are, it's like sending a kid to school on an empty stomach. It does not work for learning. And the academic recovery will come. We need to focus on prioritizing some behavioral health, sort of emotion regulation stability, in order to give them the opportunity to absorb some of that academic information. So we need to be patient with it. They'll get there. But the academic stuff is not, in my opinion, one of the biggest priorities right now. And then for youth, high school age students, it's hard to figure out what's normal, right? It's hard to know when things have been so disrupted. But if you're a teenager, think about what the length of time is in a teenage mind for 2 or 3 years, right? It's a huge chunk of your life, and it's so significant. So having a sense of what the future holds, what my options are, is very maybe unsettling for folks in that age range. For young adults, these are the folks that I work with primarily in higher ed at Seattle U, like this age demographic, and they speak to me on a regular basis about what their opportunities look like. They're not sure economically what to do. They're not sure what to do with their education. They're not sure what options are out there in terms of, how unsettled the world feels like it is to them. And then this is probably nothing new in any generation, but they also feel that there's a generational gap where boomers and millennials and anyone else, all these labels that we have, they're not understood, right? That they're going through their own challenges that other generational groups cannot possibly understand, and they feel a little bit separated in that way. For adults, I put myself squarely in this category, right? We are under financial pressure, many of us, feeling disorganized. That brain fog is really common. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but feeling distracted and that you're forgetful, and that cognitive sort of brain foggy experience is really normal, and it's widespread. And it doesn't mean there's something necessarily wrong with your brain. It's pretty common right now. I want to note that many of us are grieving relationships with people who are still alive. We've lost a lot in terms of some of our relationships, and that's part of our recovery, is the grief and loss process. And for older adults who might be either nearing retirement or in that retirement phase, it's about staying connected to friends, and it's about managing physiological illness and seeing people decline over time and the psychological stressors that go with that. So that's just a pretty brief snapshot of the high-level behavioral health concerns based on age. I'm going to switch gears really briefly and talk about some of the neurophysiology related to responder stress. Much of this is probably things you already know, or at least it's stuff that you probably experience on a regular basis, but might not have sort of that detail around, what system of your body is being affected by the types of works and exposures that you do. So the bottom line is this: our brain is designed to respond under threatening circumstances to keep us alive and to keep us safe. That's the bottom line. And what ends up happening in a disaster cascade scenario is that our brain becomes more triggered than it normally would be. Like if a bear comes out of the woods, the adrenaline gets released, we go into fight or flight or freeze mode, and we respond. 3 years into a phase pandemic, this relationship between trauma and stress and fight or flight gets really, really, really confused in our body's processing. And one of the things that I get asked regularly is, what is this relationship between trauma and stress? Not everyone has been traumatized by this pandemic. Many people have, but not everybody has. I would, however, argue that everybody has been stressed to some degree. So, friends, all trauma is stressful by nature, by definition. All trauma is stressful, but not all stress is traumatic. They can function in a very similar way physiologically. They can manifest themselves by sleep disruption, headaches, stomach aches, migraines. They can look similar, but the underlying causes, and in fact, some of the more detailed physiology, can be different in terms of how it shows up. So stress is typically gradual or event-based, more often gradual. So stress really builds up over time and kind of sneaks up on you a little bit. Tragedy is usually event-based. Trauma is usually event-based, but can also build up over time. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with ACEs. If you have adverse childhood experiences that then sort of set the stage for other types of experiences or response to experiences later in life, that can definitely combine into multifaceted traumatic responses. the question that I have rhetorically for all of you is, what are the key issues do you think for people like us who work in a world surrounded by these conditions? This is part of our day to day, living and experiencing other people's traumas and tragedies and stressors. And also, especially in this context of the pandemic, a disaster cascade, experiencing many, if not all of those things ourselves personally too. We doubled down, right? We were already signed up for a hard job, and then we were living it at the same time that we were trying to help other people and continue to do so. So as we're moving forward and we're thinking about the way that we are individually impacted by these events and experiences, there are two brain structures that are primarily involved. The first is the limbic system, and that's the part of the brain that activates. I'm using this Northwest analogy of the bear coming out of the woods, but that's the part of the brain that activates when you feel threatened, right? The amygdala, the limbic system, that's the threat sensor. The limbic system wants to respond in an impulsive, in a very quick way to keep you safe, and sometimes a more emotional way without consideration of long-term consequences. The prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, is the part of the brain that develops last. So it doesn't develop fully until people are in their early 20s. And that's the part of the brain that wants us to consider, well, maybe this isn't the best option. Maybe you have a different choice here. Maybe you shouldn't react to this person this way. Maybe consider something else. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's telling you, don't hit send on that email. Don't hit send on that text message before thinking it through and reading it a few times. The limbic system is like, yeah, hit send. It wants you to do that because it's in that keep you safe mindset for sure. So the bottom line here is that most people are walking around with slightly activated limbic systems. Some people are walking around with highly activated limbic system, just ready to go at the drop of a hat, whether that's fight or flight or freeze, right? But their limbic system is just keyed up and ready for danger and that threat response. But the bottom line here, population level wise, is that most people are activated, meaning that our ability to regulate our behavior when it comes to interacting with other people is challenged right now. And when we get activated, these are the two ways that it shows up, right? You have your first system, which is your slow cortisol HPA. It's called the HPA axis. And that's the cortisol buildup over time when we become stressed out. That's the thing. That's the system that keeps you up at night. It makes your stomach upset. That's the system that gets you to engage in what we call revenge bedtime procrastination. And that's staying up on your phone until midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning for no reason at all, besides that you want to have some kind of an escape, right? You want to get into it. And it doesn't really do much for you besides disrupt your sleep. That builds up over time. The SAM system is your adrenaline response. That's the fight or flight, the FAST system that all of you are familiar with in the crisis response work that you do. That system takes seconds. I should say it differently. It can take seconds to activate, and it can take typically 45 to 60 minutes to reabsorb adrenaline once it's really been released. So it takes a while for people to calm down, but it can be activated very, very, very quickly. Oops, lost my cursor for a second. We're going to pause here, and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen and ask Gabrielle to put up on the screen another question for you all to answer about the kinds of experiences and the challenges that you're facing so that I can put that in some context with what we're going to do next. So what are the current challenges that you're facing? And if you can enter the code in Menti, we'll get some additional baseline data for you, baseline info. Lack of concrete solutions. I really appreciate that. I'm hoping that at the end of today, you'll feel like personally that there are at least a few of those that we will be discussing together today. De-escalation, staff shortages, I'm hearing resources and beds, staffing. Yeah. Lots of demand, very little help. Thank you for identifying these things. This is helpful. Pervasive, unresolved injustice fatigue. Yes. Violence. Okay. Thank you so much for contributing to this. It's a great, diverse group of people in different positions that are here, have joined today's talk. So I really appreciate the perspectives that brings. You can continue to answer. I would encourage you to consider some additional responses if they come up for you. Gabrielle, is it possible for me to take sharing back so that I can just move on?
Yes, indeed,
Okay,
it
cool.
is.
Thank you.
And
All right.
we'll, like before, leave it so people can continue adding things if they want as they think about it. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much for adding those. So this is my list, right? This is pretty wide reaching and very broad. But I mentioned the cognitive challenges. I'll say this, it is very likely that at some point in the last 2 or 3 years, you have wondered, am I getting early onset dementia or am I getting ADHD for the first time? Because your brain is probably having trouble functioning in the way that you're used to, right? Where you can't remember if you took care of something. Did I talk to that person? You walk into the grocery store and you can't remember what it was that you were going to go get. So lots of memory things. That is really normal in these disaster cascade scenarios. Behaviorally, I mentioned the revenge bedtime procrastination, staying up for some unknown reason, right? On Instagram or TikTok or whatever. The emotional roller coaster where you feel like, okay, I've got it. It's a Tuesday. I'm going to have a great day. And then by the time you get to lunch, you're like, this is the worst week I've had in a long time, right? Socially, we have lots of disrupted relationships. Physically, we're having trouble with diet. A lot of us stress eat. I'm putting myself squarely in that category because when we eat carbohydrates, particularly, right, there's a chemical process that takes place where we get a little bit of serotonin for that. And there's a reason why people stress eat. There's a little bit of a chemical payoff down the road. Unfortunately, some of the other behavioral issues also include substance use, right? So substance use tends to go up after disasters, and this has not been any exception to that for sure. So really being aware of that. Okay. Behaviorally, I just want to mention this concept. Acting out and acting in is a normal human response to complicated disasters. It is the way we tend to express distress based on personality characteristics. And it doesn't mean anything besides it's the direction that our distress is going, right? So people who act out express their distress externally. That's aggression or hostility, maybe illegal behavior or substance use. And then internal expression of distress is acting in. And that's people who shut down and don't participate. And, even when they can, they're isolating them. When they can participate, they're choosing to isolate themselves. So it's really normal to see people who were before might have been in the middle, now kind of being drawn towards one of those two poles across the ages, right? This happens for kids as well as adults. One of the things, I'm not sure if anybody brought this up in the Mentimeter or not, and I haven't seen it in the chat that I'm aware of, but we have a real issue with time. I'll give you an example. In my head somehow, I'm still waiting for Thanksgiving to happen. I feel like I'm kind of in an October mindset, and here we are in mid-December, and it's not right. Like my brain is confused about how much time has passed and what has happened in 2022. And part of the reason for that is that our sense of time is influenced by all of our sensory perception, sight, touch, taste, smell, and sound. We don't have our own time receptors, so we need input from our environment to track time accurately. And when things are painful and when it's hard and it's challenging, it slows down. So when it's hard, it is perceived as longer. But the other side of the coin is that we're so tuned into the challenges and the threats that when it's going okay, it zips by. And so our accuracy level goes down because the work is so intense sometimes that when we're relaxing and when we're not engaged in it, it goes faster than we're able to kind of keep up with. I'm going to come back to this, but what I want to offer first in terms of a practical idea here is to recognize how essential it is to look at your 24-hour day, even drawing it out on paper, making a pie chart and saying, how do you spend your 24 hours, right? Part of that is I'm going to come back to that, but part of it is around the skill set required to transition into and out of emergency mode. This is really hard. Physiological addiction to emergencies is a very real thing. Our bodies get used to the adrenaline and the dopamine associated with solving problems and putting fires out and dealing with crisis. And we kind of like that, right? We might not like some of the work, but we like that piece of it on a chemical level. And so when we are transitioning out of that and we're just doing paperwork or we're doing some other piece of the job that isn't as exciting, our brain pushes back and it's not as able to sort of really focus in on enjoying it. It also makes it hard because of this to be at home and feel like you're enjoying some of your home time and your off time if it isn't also giving you comfort in terms of serotonin or pleasure in terms of dopamine, right? In terms of a very, very basic neurotransmitter chemical level. What are you doing in terms of your activities that you're engaged in that are healthy, right? Not substance use, not reckless driving, that kind of thing, but what are the healthy activities that are going to let you balance out these good chemicals that you're getting from this emergency responding, right? That allows you to have those good transitions from home to work and back again. So one key idea is when you get a new task, a new ask, a new client, whatever the case may be, that you start a new process. No time like the present, right? Start the new process of evaluating, does this actually have to be done right now? If the person is saying, I need this information back right away, can you push back, or at least maybe even not say anything and be like, evaluate prefrontal cortex, not limbic system. Does this actually have to be done right away, or what are my options for it? And going through that, establishing that as a process of evaluation and critical thinking will stop you from like jumping on that emergency train when you don't need to. Now, sometimes things are an emergency, right? But more often than not right now, we are continuing to sort of treat everything as if it were, when it in fact might not be. So that evaluation piece is essential. I mentioned time, and I'm going to keep coming back to this as a theme. None of this is my opinion per se, this section right here, because there is so much good research and so much data on the health effects of figuring out how, for yourself, to orient to the present moment. How do you tune in to be really aware of your present circumstances rather than being distracted by things that have happened in the past that you can't change, or things that have happened in the future or are going to happen in the future but don't exist yet, right? Where we actually are empowered on a very physiological level is to get our brains to focus on the fact that right now, in this current moment, we're okay, which is 99% of the time the case. Most of our anxiety, most of human anxiety comes from past-oriented or future-oriented thinking. And so if we can get oriented to the present, it's a much less anxious place to be. Really, really, really important. Here's the thing. I always say this. I learned this from one of my former supervisors. He always used to say, here's the thing, and then go on, right? Mindfulness doesn't work for everyone. Mindfulness can be triggering for people with a trauma history. Meditation can be triggering. It's not one size fits all. But what I want to be advocating here is that you find a way for you that works for your body and your circumstances to engage in present-oriented thinking. That could be just petting the dog. It could be sitting and breathing. It could be taking a walk. It doesn't matter what it is. We know that mindfulness and that sensory-oriented sort of guided meditation kind of process is probably one of the more effective strategies, but it doesn't have to be that if those things don't work for you. This is just an image to show you a little bit of evidence for the extent to which this is effective. The colored dot that you're seeing on this fMRI is an amygdala, the same person. And on the left side, when it's the yellow piece, it's highly active. That is how most of us are walking around, with a highly activated limbic system, highly activated amygdala that's ready ready for the next threat. The same brain on the other side of the screen is that same person who practiced 8 weeks of mindful attention. You only need to do it for about 10 to 15 minutes 10 to 15 minutes a day, in order to reduce that activity in the amygdala. And so it's observable, right? You can, and this is not just this one study. If you don't take my word for it, go click on a couple of those links because you'll have the slides available for you. That the power that we have to allow our brain to rest and recover is truly there. It is doable. And, I would argue, here's my phone right here next to me. We have 10 minutes a day that we could try to give up from all of these things that we surf around on. in order to do this. And the data are clear that it can structurally and functionally change your brain. So a little bit of effort for a huge payoff in terms of your response. Okay, impacts of the work, responder specifics, because there are some pretty unique challenges that are faced by those of us who do crisis work that I think is important to keep in mind with this. Number one is that there's a lot of stigma. Some things are less okay to do. Having a couple beers with friends is kind of more okay than taking time out to do some mindfulness or meditation. Like, we haven't gotten there yet as a cultural norm for taking care of our behavioral health. I tend to avoid the term self-care in any of these talks because self-care has been sort of abused to the extent that it feels like only something else on the to-do list that nobody has time for. And so I try to avoid the use of that term because it's sort of fallen out of favor with most people. But it doesn't mean that this idea doesn't need to be fixed, right? The idea that it's mission critical for us to figure out how to manage our behavioral health in a healthy way. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to keep going with this kind of work. The lack of political and social and cultural support, depending on the type of response work that you might be doing, is pretty extreme in some places. It depends on where you are in the country, it depends on what's going on sort of behind the scenes. There's all kinds of influences, but that can play a role too. And then also, we're going to talk briefly about suicide rates for responders that are higher than they are for the general public, and concerning for sure. I'm sure all of you know what PTSD is, but I want to make you aware, just really briefly, of the clinical criteria. All of us, and certainly everybody who does response work, has been exposed to triggering events, right? So that first piece, the diagnostic feature of experience of a trauma or actual stressor, I think we would be hard pressed to find anybody who does response work that hasn't experienced at least a handful of those kinds of things. Even vicariously, right, which still counts. It's learning about it, hearing about other people's experiences, not necessarily having your own life be threatened in some way. And then a really intense response to that experience, resulting in a lot of different symptoms, right? It's a collection of symptoms. So intrusion symptoms, that's things that like flashbacks or hallucinations or nightmares that would relive the thing. Avoiding people, places, or things associated with a traumatic event. Cognitive and mood symptoms where you just aren't yourself, you're not interested in the same kind of things. And then hyperarousal, meaning that you're just jumpy. Your body, your limbic system, and your amygdala specifically are so keyed up, ready to defend yourself, that if somebody drops something, you just kind of jump out of your skin a little bit. And then those symptoms need to be present for at least 30 days. The bottom line for me as a clinician and as a mom, both, is that, lots of people have symptoms of things, lots of different kinds of stuff. And we have to be aware of when it gets in the way. So the bottom feature is the most important for me. It must cause clinically significant distress or impairment. It has to interfere in some way with the kinds of things that we're doing. And I urge you to consider and to do a little bit of an evaluation for yourself about whether or not you think this is at play for you. I also strongly want to urge you to consider that distress under these circumstances is normative. Being distressed does not mean that you qualify for a diagnosis. Being distressed doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means that you're responding as any human would under incredibly stressful circumstances. And so just making that distinction clear between a diagnosis and sort of a normative human response. The things that influence PTSD are sociocultural, like how close you are to the incident or incidents that happen, the psychological factors. The only one I'm going to mention on here, I think that's worth noting verbally as well, is this idea of shattering assumptions. And this is based on something called belief in a just world theory. Belief in a just world is a incorrect paradigm that says good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And it's not the case, obviously. But if you have grown up in an environment where your lived experience has shown you that that may be the case, when something bad happens, because bad things inevitably happen, it rocks your world. And I'll just use this example anecdotally. I have seen much more. I did a lot of work in Haiti for several years after the earthquake, and I have seen, there's actually a wonderful article that I would love to share with you all about everything we know about resilience we could have learned from the Haitians, because the degree of perseverance and resilience that's sort of inherent in living under stressful circumstances and conditions is mind-blowing, really. And it's important to recognize that this idea of feeling like you're in a safe little bubble is something we have to address. We have to address in order to move forward collectively. PTSD by the numbers. Okay. There's just a couple of key takeaways, and I did include some of the links down below for additional resources if you're curious. More than 80% of first responders experience traumatic events. That includes crisis workers of any kind. Please keep that in mind. Oh, thank you very much for including those links in the chat for folks who wanted to check it out. PTSD is, let's just say it this way, significantly more common for people who do response work than it is for members of the general public. So the exposure that you all and we all have doing some of the types of works that we do are risk factors for sure. 37% of EMS personnel and firefighters have considered suicide at some point. This is nearly 10 times higher than the rate in the average American. I think we need to do a whole lot more work. And again, I really want this webinar not to be about adding more to anyone else's plate, but if we can work on being culturally more transparent around what we need and what our concerns are and what we're struggling with, that would address this, that would help this. That doesn't solve all these problems, but it allows people who are in helping roles, who are always the helpers, to be a helpee and to normalize that as a cultural response, that we hold everyone and we care for everyone, even the carers. I think that would have a significant effect on some of these risk factors for responders for sure. I'm going to transition now and wrap up with what we know works before sharing the Thrive model with you. I mentioned I was going to come back to time. So for those of you who signed up today to get practical ideas about what to do, this is the section of the webinar for you. Consider drawing a pie, like I mentioned, and prioritizing out looking at how you spend your 24 hours. How much time is asleep? How much time is at work? How much time is at home, etc. And then what would you be willing to change? How could you make some adjustments to some of those boundaries where you're doing different things with your 24 hours? When I was in graduate school, the reason why this slide is called this is because I had a supervisor that I complained to. I said, I don't have enough time to get everything done. And he looked at me and he said, but you have all the time that there is. And I didn't respond well to that at the time. It made me mad. But the point being is that he wasn't wrong. Nobody has a secret bucket of time. It's what we do with the time that we have and how we can prioritize certain things that we need to prioritize, not just because we want to or it would be fun, but we have to. We've recognized in the context of this pandemic that taking care of ourselves is an essential piece of being able to do the work, not just an option, and move forward from there. And for those of you who are in supervisory or leadership roles, one of the things that I'd like you to consider is that this idea of what could be different on your team if your colleagues could observe you handling stress or pressure in a healthier way. Not better, right? Not more successfully covering it up. No, I'm not talking about that. But how could it influence the dynamic of the team or the group if observably you handle pressure in a healthier way with better boundaries, with different ideas about saying, let's think our way through this rather than going into a crisis response when we don't need to. If you can try to approach unexpected negative events from a challenge mindset rather than a threat mindset, it's incredibly effective. The psychological moderators of stress include, there are many, but I picked these three. Something called explanatory style, which is how you explain things that have already happened in the past in your head. Locus of control, which is how you explain the present and the future. Like, how much control do I think I have over what happens to me versus fate and sort of up to something else besides me. And then psychological hardiness is very similar to resilience. So explanatory style is is sort of split into two, right? And just by looking at this, I'm guessing that many of you are able to identify which style you might sort of lend yourself towards. So an optimistic style, I'm going to use an education example just because I have so many students that I work with. But let's say that I have a student who gets an A on a test. If they have an optimistic style, that's because they think that's because I'm a good student. That's because I studied really hard and I earned this kind of a thing. If they have a pessimistic style and they get an A, they say, well, that's because she made the test, someone, not them, made the test too easy, right? It was just a fluke, just kind of this one-time thing. And it's a flip-flop, right? So if you have a more optimistic style, you're able to internalize the good stuff. You're able to say, I did that, and this is who I am, and it's part of your identity. If you have a more pessimistic style, it's the flip, it's the reverse of that, where you think that the good things are more up to fate and chance, and it's not about your personal characteristics. And we can work on that. So if you're curious about taking a quiz, you can find lots online around this. Just be careful that it's not the typical clickbait kind of a thing, and try to look for a quiz with some good psychometrics if you can. This one, I think Gabrielle can put the link in the chat, but I would encourage you not to do it now. You can do it after the webinar or at any time that's helpful for you. I found this one, and it's got some fairly decent psychometric properties to it for locus of control. If you're curious about internal versus external locus of control. We used to think scientifically that having an internal locus of control, meaning I am in charge of what happens to me, was a healthier thing. And in many cases, that's true. In many circumstances, that's true, but not all circumstances. And it turns out that when you are overwhelmed with an emergency, that having an external locus of control, where you sort of just say, okay, it's out of my hands. I'm going to focus on what I can control over here, but the rest of this is out of my hands. That's actually can be, not for everybody, but it can be a healthy perspective as well. So if you're curious about locus of control, go ahead and take that quiz after the webinar today. Psychological hardiness is akin to resilience. And this is a personality factor, right? That's consisting of a sense of commitment, which is also connection, a sense of control, which I would argue is also a sense of purpose and motivation, right? And then a sense of challenge. This is this adaptability where I'm gonna tackle things based on the resources that I have, one step at a time, line it up. What do I do first? Rather than as you might engage if a bear comes out of the woods. Hopefully not. I don't know why I'm stuck on the bear. All right. So this picture of resilience might also remind you of those characteristics of psychological hardiness that I just mentioned. The first ingredient is purpose. And this is the fruit of the tree. This is what you're producing. This is what gets you out of bed. Now, if you recall, I know I speak quickly and there's a lot of information in this talk, but if you recall, when looking at leadership, having a strong sense of purpose was one of the most predictive variables for how leaders can handle stress effectively. And a sense of purpose is really around understanding why you do the work that you do. And Christina and I were talking before the webinar started today about how hard it is sometimes when you're in crisis work and it's overwhelming and there's so much need to really remember why it is that you do the work. And here's something that I would encourage you to think of. Number one, it's okay for your sense of purpose to be different now than it was even a couple of years ago. It would be kind of weird for it to be exactly the same because we've been through so many changes. If you haven't sort of reevaluated your sense of motivation and purpose in the last couple of years, I would strongly recommend that you do that. Thinking about what are the things that really matter to you moving forward, because that will help with motivation a great deal. The second, excuse me, one sec. The second ingredient of resilience is connection, and those are the roots of the tree. That's your people, right? It could be pets, it could be friends, it could be people online that have the same hobbies you do, it could be a faith community, it could be your family members. It doesn't matter. There's no wrong way, but you need to be connected. Humans need to be connected. And then the final link, I'm sorry, I skipped hope. The third link in resilience is adaptability, and that's the trunk of the tree. We don't really like to adapt, humans, the collective big we like things to be predictable and to go the same way. And I would really strongly encourage you to really look at hope and adaptability pairing with each other nicely, because adaptability is around rolling with change and figuring out a new way to do stuff that works, right? And that's where hope comes in. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. Hope is about recognizing that nothing shakes stuff up like a big disaster. And because of this pandemic, we have the opportunity to listen to new voices and to do things in a different way and change structures because they have to change, and support each other around behavioral health in a way that we never were really allowed to do, or it wasn't sort of supported. Let me tell you, behavioral health is now pretty top of agenda in most private and public organizations around the country because people aren't doing very great. And so it took a crisis for us to finally acknowledge this and recognize this. But now, guess what? Now we've got CEOs talking about resilience in a meaningful way. And we've got changes that are being made to address some of these issues. And there's a lot of room for hope in that because there's new opportunity. So hope is around realistic new opportunities for things. In terms of additional recommendations I want to provide, this is probably the most helpful thing that you can do when someone is experiencing a behavioral health crisis. I'm guessing that all of you do this professionally on a regular basis. I'm guessing that very few of you do this on a personal level because you're tired and you don't want to, maybe when you get home and are done working, or you're burnt out to the point where you just can't bring yourself to try and empathize with someone else's experience. So here's the thing. Active listening is one of the most helpful interventions we have, right? We know that it works. It allows the speaker to work through their concerns. It increases connection between the speaker and the listener, which is part of resilience. But if you are struggling with burnout personally to such a degree that you just can't bring yourself to do this, please don't try and do it, right? That means that the priority needs to be on your capacity building and on you taking care of yourself to the extent that you have boundaries in place so that you can refill yourself in order to do the work again as soon as you're available to, right? Because the work will be there, but it's about making sure that you will be available to do the work if you take care of yourself. Okay. I've joked so many times. Christina has heard me talk about this a lot, but I've joked for years that I could make my entire clinical career off of people's issues with their parents and with boundaries. We do not do a good job, the collective big we, all of us, on boundaries. Boundaries are hard. They're easier to maintain once you've established them. But if you don't have a lot of practice establishing healthy boundaries, it's hard to do. It's not an option. Having good boundaries around our work time is something that we have to do. And establishing good boundaries also comes with the acceptance that not everything is always going to get done. It just can't. And you really have to take a longer view. Are you going to be able to do this work for another 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years? Or are you going to be so tired and suffering from compassion fatigue or burnout to such an extent where you can't do the work anymore and then you're one less person in this field? The boundaries help protect and sort of rehabilitate you in your off time and in your recovery time in order to re-engage in the work again later. Okay. We're not going to take time to switch over to a Mentimeter, but what I would want to ask you to add in the chat is what are some training needs or other supports that would help you in your work? And if you can add those into the chat now, I'm going to carry on just for the interest of time. I do want to save a little bit of time for Q&A. But if you can add your comments to the chat about what training needs or other supports would be helpful. I'm guessing that a lot of them are probably going to be based around some of the needs that you identified early on in the webinar with staffing support and whatnot, but please go ahead and add those to the chat.
Well, and Kira, actually, we had set up a slided Mentimeter, so people can just type it into that without disrupting what's going on here as well. So I think the link is put in there too. So thank you, everybody. It's really amazing to see what you've been sharing. So thank you.
Yeah, if you can put the if you can put it in Mentimeter, it helps us collect all the information in one spot, which is great for sure. Yeah. First responders. Yeah, I do a lot of work with first responders. I'm just looking at the chat. Tiffany, I hear you. Healthy boundaries when you are sort of professionally and by nature a helper is really, really hard to do, but it's essential too. I'm just going to give people a moment, and then I will move back on. This is the last section of the webinar today before we do Q&A.
The other thing I wanted to share, we're asking this to get in tune with what is on your mind, but we definitely are committed to trying to do additional activities for people doing crisis work, both telephonically and other routes, and also in person. And with 988 and crisis teams starting to really, support the system in a bigger way, we want to be responsive to the kinds of things that you actually tell us are needs of yours and your priorities. So this is helpful for today, but also for future planning. There are a lot of conversations around the field, so do appreciate your input. So thank you.
Yeah. Are we getting some things in the Mentimeter?
Yeah.
All right. Good.
So
Thank
however
you all.
people want to do it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay. I'm going to move on for the sake of time and share the Thrive model with you. This is about trying to reconnect us based on content. Now, in psychology, of course, we say process over content, right? How we do things is often much, much more important than what. But this model is designed to give you pieces of content to focus on or to try and keep in mind as you're moving forward in your work. Based on, and it's sort of a summary of evidence-based outcomes for organizations, disaster recovery, clinical psychology, that kind of thing. So it has 5 components. I left the V. I can't believe I just caught this. Gabrielle, we got to fix this. It has 6 components, 1 for each letter, and we left off values and vision for V. Oh my goodness sake. I'm just going to dive in. So the first one is transparency. And this is a content area of focus that can show up in all kinds of different ways, at work, on a personal scale, and on a social and cultural level as well. This is about modeling the behavior that you think is important. This is about discussing and being a little bit more transparent around behavioral health needs and issues. Now, I want to be clear, talking about turning your regular team meeting into a therapy session for everyone, but I am talking about, being willing to say, I need to take some mental health time, or I'm struggling with whatever it is that you're struggling with. Just like we would say, I have the flu, right? Or whatever it is, I can't come in. Like I'm not feeling very well. Like I'm on a mental level. That line is going to be different for each individual person. So I'm not saying that everybody just has to go hard on sleeve, just sharing everything. But I do think that we need to be more willing and aware to include behavioral health acknowledgement and recognition in our professional world. We can't just say, when we get to work, we turn it off and now we don't have issues, right? That's not the case. We bring our whole selves to the work that we do. Sammy added in the chat, trauma-informed care. Yeah, absolutely. Being transparent about the need for including all of these things. Share the not so good, share the unknowns, the whole self. The next piece of healthy engagement builds off of what we were just discussing with healthy boundaries. I would argue very strongly that it is impossible to have healthy engagement in your professional work if you don't have the opportunity to recover in your off time. And so it starts with boundaries. It starts with establishing healthy boundaries so that you have on-call time, if that's part of your job, and off time. And the off bucket needs to be protected. You are not available during your off time. You're not checking emails, you're not responding to phone calls. And if everybody does that and assists each other in doing it, then it allows you to have much more clear-cut structure around your 24-hour cycle. Because rather than being on and less on, right, it's on call if needed, and off. And we need to support each other in developing that off bucket for sure. The R in the Thrive model is respect for people, respecting individual differences, respecting voices, respecting perspectives, including members of the community at the table to make decisions that are inherently affecting them. One of the biggest things too here, especially from a trauma-informed perspective, is respecting lived experience of someone else that's very different from your own, right? Including those conversations and that perspective in the decision-making is truly, I think, one of the opportunities that we have here to change some of the systemic stuff. Disasters shine a spotlight on disparities and existing equity issues and inequality. And it also provides us, as a function of that spotlight, the opportunity to mobilize towards changing some of these things too. Thriving with a focus on integration. Integration has 3 levels. Number 1 is as a team, making sure that when you show up, that why you're doing it and what you're there to do on an organizational or team mission sort of a level is the same as what other people are there to do. You're not out just on your own. The second level of integration is about your personal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We know from the research that to the extent that your thoughts and your feelings and your behaviors are aligned and integrated with each other, there's less anxiety, right? Because if you're acting in a way that's really different from how you're thinking and feeling on the inside, that does not feel good. It's usually some anxiety associated with that. And then the third piece is limbic system and prefrontal cortex, getting your brain to integrate with itself on the inside, because that is where good decision making happens. You don't want to be responding from that limbically oriented threat response place when you don't need to. And so getting that full neurological integration is healthy too. The V in the Thrive model is about values and vision. I know there's someone posted in the chat a link to a values exercise. There's lots of different ways to do this, but if you have never considered what your personal core values are, I would strongly recommend thinking about what are 2 or 3 at the most, 2 or 3 key values for you personally that you can focus on operationalizing when you do your work and when you're at home with your kids, with your parents, siblings, social connections. If you want to be X type of person, for me, I'll just use my example. Mine is patient. Patience is one of my core values that's very hard for me. I have a Fornado at home, a 4-year-old, and he gives me opportunities to be patient every day. But the bottom line with my patience is that if I want to be a more patient person, I need to try to practice that in my different roles that I play. And if I do, it's going to be a better day for me. Things are going to go better if I'm acting and making choices that are consistent with my core values. And that's one of them. So mine are different from yours. Everybody has different ones. Nobody gets to judge that or decide what they are except for you. But if you haven't thought about what those fundamental things are that can sort of help you, give you some structure for your reactions to other people and your choices, I would encourage you to do that. The last part of the Thrive model here is effort. This is about recognizing the effort that people are putting in, calling it out in a way that it lands. I'm sure that most of you have heard of the 5 love languages. This is the same kind of thing. It's called languages of appreciation, and it's workplace appropriate. So as you can probably guess, there's no physical touch, or it would just be like an elbow or a high five or something. I don't know. But the 5 love languages are akin to the 5 languages of appreciation that we can use in the workplace to express gratitude, rather than just putting somebody's name in an email, right? Finding a way to express gratitude in a way that's meaningful for them and acknowledging that effort. And then the last thing I want to leave you with is the idea of a good coping plan. A good coping plan, you could put it on a sticky note if you want to. That's a little bit, I mean, it works for some folks. I have a color-coded Excel spreadsheet for mine. That's not for everybody either. It doesn't matter what it looks like. What matters is that you have organized for yourself a list of things you can do after a really tough shift, a bad week, a bad day, and they have to have different time frames, meaning you need things on your coping plan that you can do in 3 minutes at work. Between calls or between clients, you need things on your coping plan that you can do in an hour in the evening or on a weekend. If everything on your coping plan takes an hour, you're never going to do it, right? And only put stuff on there that works for you. Like I do not have, Christina and I were joking about this earlier, I do not have journaling or yoga on my coping plan because I will not do those 2 things. They don't work for me. But they do work for a lot of other folks. So please consider it. This is an example. Again, you will have access to all of these slides when they're sent. So don't worry about taking notes on this right now. It's just an example for you of a coping plan. And that's it for me. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can address some of these questions.
Great. Thank you so much. You can hear you say literally probably the same slides, the same content. I remembered when you first talked about early in the pandemic, everyone thinking that they had, ADD or, early onset dementia, and like, oh my gosh, that's where, never mind everything else that everyone's facing. Yeah. So I just love that you have this research lens, you have this practical lens, you're a teacher, a mom, a trainer, a therapist, like you've got all the stuff covered. And yeah, you get through a lot of information. This is going to be recorded. Slides will be available. You know, it's a lot to digest, but it seems like it always lands. We do have one question, and I think this is something we've talked about as well. I also want to mention, we'll put it in the chat, but we are recording most times when we have a webinar, a podcast with the presenters as well. So Kira and I have done that today, and we did it from last week. But it's that buzzword of, you know, so we're not calling it self-care. What about resilience? Is this a substitute for change that's really needed in our system? And she, person says, as a nurse, I've noticed it seems to be used as a way to place the onus on the oppressed group or the people suffering. Do you have thoughts on how to engage with this issue in the workplace? And I think this couldn't be a better question for today's topic.
Yeah, this is complicated. I'm really glad you brought this up because it happens in all sectors, right? It's not just healthcare. It happens in education and in private companies where the workforce feels like the leadership or administration, however that's structured, says, you all need to be more resilient. We're just going to keep doing business as usual, and you just need to be more resilient. And that's unfortunately far too common of an experience. And I think that's what your question is sort of alluding to. That is not how resilience works, right? So I would encourage you to think of it, not that there's a fault with the concept of resilience, but there is a fault with the interpretation of the fact that any oppressed group needs to be the one that's fixing the problem. That's not structurally possible or likely and or healthy for sure. And so it's not just resilience as a word. We could use other words like equity. We could use other words that people talk about a lot, but there's not a lot of action. So fundamentally, what it comes down to is understanding what a resilient organization looks like and how that functions, which is inclusive, and recognizing voices of people that are in oppressed groups, like a nursing cohort in a hospital or something. And it's impossible for the organization to be resilient when it is keeping down a piece of the group that's part of it. That's not. It's false, right? It's an inherently false concept for how resilience is operationalized. So that's one piece. The other piece is that, resilience, in order to do it the right way, it's behaviorally manifested. If you can talk about anything, but unless the behavior manifests the change, it doesn't have any meaning behind it. So healthy boundaries are great to talk about, but it means nothing if the CEO is sending an email at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday and expecting someone else to respond to it by noon on a Sunday, right? That's the mixed messaging. It's about walking the talk, not just about talking. So
well, and I think I would be curious, I know people are probably needing to get back to their jobs, but if people have had good experiences implementing something in their work environments or on their teams, it'd be great to, have folks put that in the chat, or if there's a model. I think, for some, it may be just taking a few minutes at the beginning of every meeting or morning huddle or shift change to just take a couple minutes to just center yourself and then think about what can be. This happened to me, 15 years ago, and it really changed how one of our teams really operated. It was constantly doing crisis work, but how do we ourselves not be in crisis mode, as a being, as a person? So, sort of thinking, okay, what is it that I'm feeling right now? How do I, within the work setting, share where I'm coming from today so I can be of best use to the people I'm serving and my team, and be clear, it's not a 4-hour rant about family or some other thing that's really struggling us, but, something people, are experiencing difficult things all day long. And we never know what people are experiencing. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you have to say to yourself, maybe they've had a terrible day and I can't engage in that and get upset because this is just going to spiral. But, how can I keep showing up at work and be realistic and effective? So I think that's challenging. Yeah, I love seeing some of those ideas. I was just talking to our team, about if you're doing something like a conference or you're traveling for work or doing other things, things that are related to work is work time to me, so if you have that flexibility, like you should not be like eating those hours when it's something we asked you to do, or it's something that, you are doing for a job, that you probably didn't get on this airplane to go to a conference because you just wanted to. So if we're asking you to do something, that whole thing should be sort of covered, as far as your time. It takes it out of you. Other thoughts that you've seen teams or agencies implement, Kira, as far as making some kind of change that is actually effective in those parameters that you named?
Yeah, I think many companies are struggling with how to do that. They're not sure how to operationalize this. And I don't know of any company or organization that has it nailed down, right? Done it well. But I think we can take pieces of good examples from a lot of different sectors. So some things that I've heard of, it'd be let's assume you're working a 40-hour work week, that large companies have taken an hour out of the 40 hours that you still get paid for like you regularly do, but you would be expected to do something for yourself. You would be expected to have a nap or go for a walk or do some mindfulness or whatever, but it's one paid hour out of your 40-hour week that is intended to be designed to support just you in the way that you want. A lot of other things are free in terms of resources that are getting people to do things in a community setting. So mindfulness or guided meditation or going for walks or engaging in hobbies together to increase connection, and do some behavioral health support in community. So those are two kinds of things. Another thing that's just really basic is to start your meetings at 5 after the hour. So it gives people that extra 5 minutes to take a break or stand up, just being aware of those little nuances and how they can build up. So.
Well, and for some, I'm seeing in the chat, for folks that are working from home, I think that's been a different kind of challenge. So even if you're leaving to go do the job, if you're working at all in your home, it's, having some sort of boundaries or setting some parameters around that. I don't know if you've seen that, have recommendations.
The boundaries would be physical and temporal, right? So if you're working at your dining room table, then it's really important to set structure around when is it a dining room table and when is it your workstation, and have that be clear. So you're not sort of constantly, it's both, right? Because that actually takes a huge mental toll. If you have the privilege of or space for separate space, that's great. That's best. Not everybody does. It's hard to come by sometimes. So separating your space and then separating your time if you can't separate your physical space.
Yeah. Well, we have just a minute left. I want to share a couple things before we go, but thank you so much for your time. We could certainly do this all day, every day. And I know you're literally in an airport doing something else before this and flying home to do something else, I assume, when you get back, and, also coming back to your family. So thank you for always prioritizing, our requests and getting your expertise. I really appreciate it. And thank you.
My pleasure. I'm glad that the tech worked out today. Thank you so much.
Yes. So just to let folks know, we do have, not from us, but we have a couple of events coming up from our partners. So I don't know that I said this very clearly, but anything from any of these networks are available for free. And so here's a couple of topics, and we'll put those in the chat. If you aren't connected to our, social, not that I'm really for that, but website or getting newsletter announcements about events, please feel free to sign up. You'll get a notice on where this recording and slides and all that will be available. Other than that, we do hope you can take care today, and thank you for taking time out of your day. We hope you can take something with you to help yourself stay in this work. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care. Bye, everybody.